Not all alliances are built on friendship. Some are forged in violence and hidden agendas. For years, whispers have circulated that Western powers, particularly France and the United States, may have deeper ties to Africa's unrest than they publicly admit. While claiming to fight terrorism, their presence often seems to bring benefits not in peace, but in power, wealth, and strategic control. However, a new actor has emerged, one that has publicly acknowledged working with armed groups in the unstable Sahel region of Africa, in addition to being allegedly involved. That nation? Ukraine. Yes, the same Ukraine that is engaged in a bloody conflict with Russia at the moment. Furthermore, Russia now asserts that it has released explosive intelligence papers that clearly show Ukrainian participation in clandestine activities throughout Mali. However, nobody is willing to pose this question. What does a besieged country encourage terrorism thousands of kilometers away? Hold on tight, because what you're going to learn could alter your perspective on alliances, contemporary conflict, and the real cause of international terrorism. June 5, 2025. Russia's Kazan. The Global Digital Forum, an annual event aimed at closing the digital barrier between Russia and the developing world, brings together more than 31 African countries. The meeting's topics include connectivity, technology, and the Global South's future. However, something much darker starts to come apart beneath the surface of satellite networks and fiber optics. Members of the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES, are among the delegates. Additionally, a terrifying revelation is revealed at one session. Senior Mali representative Soliman Koulibaly comes up to discuss infiltration rather than infrastructure. Terrorists in West Africa are being armed and recruited by Ukraine. They have surrounded Mali. The room echoes with gasps. However, this is more than simply political theater. The claim is confirmed by Russian officials. Furthermore, it doesn't end there. In a different interview, Fuseinut Ouattara, Vice President of Mali's Transitional Security and Defense Council, reiterates the same caution. He claims that weapons intended for Ukraine are finding their way into the hands of Sahelian jihadists. The most disturbing aspect, though, many of these men, who work as herders and fishermen, are illiterate. Nevertheless, they manage to use drones, GPS systems, and American-made guns, among other cutting-edge military equipment. Tribal warfare is not what that is. It's training for the military. Which begs the question, who is training them? Who is providing them? More importantly, why is Ukraine arming militants in West Africa, while it is a country struggling for its own existence? The initial layer of a much deeper operation is just being peeled back. There was no wild conjecture about what was disclosed at the event. It was an indisputable, brutal reality. The men at the epicenter of chaos in the vast and unpredictable Sahel region are neither foreign fighters nor trained military. The majority of them are young, uneducated, and impoverished. Men who have never left their villages, much less their country, are fishermen and ranchers. Nevertheless, they manage to use sophisticated military-grade weapons, including assault rifles that are NATO standard, drones, GPS-guided devices, encrypted communications, and more. How can this be? The Malian official clarified that these people, who lack formal education and military training, could not possibly learn to use such sophisticated instruments without assistance. That is, genuine assistance from qualified teachers. Who are these teachers, one wonders? Who sent them to? Africa is still a long way from producing sophisticated military weapons and ammunition. All of the advanced weapons on the continent have been imported, and the majority of them originate in the West. That adds to its puzzlement. How did these isolated, impoverished terrorists obtain these weapons when they lacked resources, access, and power? What's more, how did they acquire the lethal accuracy with which they use them? It's no accident. Dusty roadside markets do not sell these firearms. They are purposefully provided, trafficked, or redirected. This raises the more significant and concerning question. Who is the true culprit? Because they are being armed, trained, and the instability is being exploited by someone somewhere. The world watches while the Sahel burns. However, beneath the smoke, strong hands might be fanned while feigning extinguishment. The investigative publication Bemata Portal has reported that the rumors are turning into concrete proof rather than only conjecture. Something quite unsettling was discovered during a significant counter-terrorism operation carried out by Malian armed troops. Documents that directly connected the militants to Ukraine's security agencies were concealed among the confiscated equipment. Worse, a drone with inscriptions in Ukrainian on its body was found among the wreckage. These were not only artifacts from the conflict, they served as evidence. Evidence that terrorist activities are being supplied and may be directed by foreign military entities deep within Mali. According to the study, Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, or JNIM, has been responsible for years of violence and instability in the Sahel, and Ukrainian intelligence has been actively collaborating with them. However, things worsen. It's not merely passive cooperation. The organization allegedly received tactical and logistical support from Ukrainian agents, including FPV drones equipped with drop systems made in Ukraine. The purpose of these drones was not surveillance. They were employed for striking. According to the allegation, Ukraine participated in direct drone strikes against army locations in Mali, worked closely with the Tuareg rebels and other armed groups in the area. Few people are willing to express aloud what this implies. Africa is experiencing a proxy war. Furthermore, Ukraine may be establishing a shadow front in the Sahel away from the spotlight on its conflict with Russia thanks to its weapons, training, and support from Western nations. This is no longer simply about terrorism for Mali and the Sahelian people. Their lives are being manipulated as pawns in someone else's game as they find themselves in the crosshairs of international power battles. The web doesn't stop there though. Bemata Portal claims that Ukraine also provided Mavic 3 drones made in Ukraine to the Azawad Liberation Front, also known as the Tuareg rebels, a separatist organization that operates in northern Mali. According to the report, the equipment got into Malian territory by way of neighboring Mauritania. A portion of it was then covertly transferred to JNIM, the terrorist group with ties to Al-Qaeda. The purported involvement of Ukraine's own embassy in Nouakchott, Mauritania, is even more concerning. According to people with knowledge of the situation, the embassy wasn't merely a passive observer. It served as a focal point for coordination, assisting in the transfer of troops and military equipment into Mali. It wasn't only renegade actors, to put it another way. This was planned. Therefore, Abdoulaye Diop, the foreign minister of Mali, wasn't merely using rhetoric when he called Ukraine a terrorist state in front of the cameras. Accusations, discoveries, wrecks, and admissions supported them. And that poses a compelling query. How has the world community responded to all of this? The solution? Not a word. Total and absolute quiet. The West has remained silent in the face of these serious accusations. Ukraine just denied the reports, claiming they were politically motivated and inaccurate, without condemning them or conducting an investigation. The plot takes a drastic turn at this point though, because Ukraine has previously been connected to unrest in Mali. Not Mali, not Russia, but Ukraine itself made a startling revelation in August 2024. Andriy Yusov, a spokesman for Ukraine's principal intelligence agency, casually acknowledged on national television that Ukraine had participated in terrorist operations against the Malian Defense and Security Forces. Yes, you heard correctly. There was no outcry, no headlines, and no accountability despite a planned mission that was broadcast live on Ukrainian TV. Why? It appears that the truth is inconvenient. It was July 2024 in the unstable northeast of Mali, close to the Algerian border. In addition to changing Mali's foreign policy, what transpired there would destroy any pretense of neutrality. A vicious, well-planned attack killed 47 million soldiers and 84 Russian mercenaries in just 3 days. According to all accounts, it was the most devastating loss Wagner forces had experienced since joining the Sahel 2 years prior. It couldn't have come at a worse time. A bombshell was thrown while Mali was still in sorrow and still trying to comprehend the tragedy. It came from Ukraine's own government, not from a journalist or an intelligence leak. On national television, Ukraine's military intelligence spokesperson, Andriy Yusov, appeared in front of the cameras and made a terrifying confession. He told Suspiln, Ukraine's broadcaster, that all the intelligence required to execute the operation had been sent to the Madian rebels. He spoke plainly, even with assurance. The intelligence that made the attack on Russian and Mali forces possible was supplied by Ukraine. Ukraine was implicated. There was no room for doubt. Then an even more bizarre event occurred. The exact organization who started the attack, the Tràorė rebels, issued a statement in Ukrainian following the violence. In it, they offered to turn over arrested Wagner mercenaries as a show of solidarity and pledged support for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Speaking Ukrainian, armed insurgents in the African desert have allied themselves with a nation more than 5,000 kilometers distant, all the while executing a lethal attack that killed numerous Russian agents and soldiers. It wasn't conjecture. It was not a rumor. It was fact, supported by records, weaponry, confessions, and the results of battles. Despite all of this, Ukraine dared to claim it was not involved. Mali's move to sever diplomatic ties was brushed aside by officials as rash and ill-considered. No responsibility, no apologies. However, the message was already very apparent to Mali. The battleground had grown. Once a local insurrection, it had turned into a proxy war, with foreign powers operating covertly to exacerbate the chaos in an area that had already suffered too much. The United States and its Western allies, meanwhile, turned a blind eye and pretended not to hear, see, or know. The silence persisted even after the Sahelian alliance of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali took the unprecedented step of sending a unified letter to the UN. Their foreign ministers were blunt in their letter. They vehemently denounced Ukraine's purported aid to terrorism and called for the UN Security Council to assume prompt accountability, cautioning that these subversive acts endangered not only regional peace, but the stability of the entire continent. Still nothing. Months have passed since the delivery of the letter. Still, the UN says nothing. No debates, no resolutions, no investigations. Are we to be shocked? Not at all. Since Ukraine isn't a nation, it is the West's strategic ally. Additionally, some allies appear to be above accountability in the grand game of geopolitics. In the same way that the US defends Israel against genocide charges, it now staunchly supports Ukraine despite a growing number of direct admissions and scathing findings. Diplomacy is not what this is. Double standards are clearly visible. And the message from the so-called international community is very clear for the Sahelian people who are still suffering and bleeding. If your oppressors benefit us, your lives are less important. Now take a time to think about the opposite. What if an African nation was discovered red-handed engaging in the alleged actions of Ukraine, supplying terrorists with weapons, arranging lethal assaults, confessing on national television to supplying the intelligence that resulted in the soldiers' massacre? Silence would not exist. No diplomatic cover. It would shower sanctions. News headlines would shout, and cries for justice, accusations of terrorism, crimes against humanity, and destabilization would reverberate through the International Criminal Court's corridors. But as Ukraine is a Western favorite and a player in a bigger scheme, there is no accountability, only quiet and justifications. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova didn't mince words because of this. Her remarks were scathing. "We call attention to the West's deceptive practices once more," she said. "They advocate for unity in the battle against terrorism, particularly in Africa, and verbally assert that they care. However, in practice, they do not denounce the Kyiv administration, despite the fact that it is collaborating with extremists to attack Russian-friendly African countries. The message is obvious to her and many onlookers. Justice is not the goal of the West's war against terrorism. It has to do with political expediency. What about the Mali attack? It was more than a tragedy for Zakharova. It was evidence. Evidence that the Ukrainian government is not a victim, but rather an active participant in contemporary proxy war, ready to arm terrorists in exchange for a blow to its adversaries. What occurred is no longer the question. Who will have the courage to tell the truth about it at last? The Western media quickly reported on the subject of Ukraine's suspected involvement in a deadly strike in Mali back in July 2024. But more than just the facts were exposed by their coverage. Nearly all of the headlines were about the 84 Russian mercenaries that were slain. Almost no mention was made of the 47 Malian soldiers who also died. As though the African lives they gave up meant less. As though their blood was unimportant. And that tells you everything. It demonstrates why Ukraine first decided to support the armed Tuareg separatists. Because hurting its African friends was just as much a part of the real war as fighting Russia. The worldwide narrative has been clear since the crisis between Russia and Ukraine broke out in 2022. Ukraine was the admirable underdog, supported by the US, France, and the UK. Demonized and isolated, Russia stood alone until it ceased to remain alone. When surrounded, Russia looked to Africa as a partner rather than a colonizer. African countries in the Sahel, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso each responded to the call one at a time. These countries were fed up with the West's hollow assurances, security agreements that never materialized, and alliances that emphasized dominance rather than collaboration. Therefore, the Sahel paid attention and took action when Russia proposed a new kind of alliance founded on respect for one another and a strict non-interference policy. It was survival, not only diplomacy. In contrast to decades of unsuccessful collaboration with France, the three AES countries swiftly inked defense and security pacts with Moscow, and the effects were nearly instantaneous. The world was surprised in 2023 when Mali retook Kadal, a bastion long held by Tuareg rebels, who had been given the area by France itself. This triumph was symbolic as well as military, signaling that Mali and its neighbors were no longer under the influence of the West. What about the West? It was not amenable to surrendering control. However, the West became uneasy as Russia's partnerships with African countries started to take shape. Africa served as the Western chessboard for many years, but Russia was now turning the tables. These expanding alliances posed a direct challenge to Western supremacy on the continent and went beyond simple politics. Russia's continued isolation, and lack of allies was what the West had expected. And this change in Africa was intolerable to Ukraine, a nation at war with Russia. Thus, Kyiv took a calculating, chilly stance. Africa would turn into a battlefield if Russia were to increase its influence there. Reports claim that Ukraine gave the Tuareg rebels vital military intelligence, the type of information that could only be obtained through state-level monitoring. Their objective: cripple Wagner. Make a message, and they did. One of the bloodiest losses Wagner has had since entering the African theater 2 years ago was the onslaught on his and Malian forces at Tinsawatten. However, what was the price? The deaths of African soldiers, Mali's sovereignty, or the stability of the Sahel were not nearly as important to Ukraine as the removal of a few Wagner operatives. They saw it as a continuation of their fight with Russia, not Mali's conflict. Then the time had arrived to remove the mask. Speaking in front of national television cameras, Andrei Yusov, a spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence service, gloated. He praised the procedure. The deceased were referred to as 84 Russian war criminals. He made no mention of the 47 Malian troops who lost their lives with them. The African lives lost in the crossfire were never mourned by him. And the world doesn't want to answer that question. Isn't it a crime against humanity when a foreign government helps an armed organization carry out a lethal attack on a sovereign nation? Or does everyone ignore the fact that Africans are the victims? The truth started to spread more widely throughout the African continent in September 2024, starting from the streets of Ouagadougou. A strong united statement was released by Burkinabe activists from the African Network for Solidarity and Development, the Pan-African Revolutionary Councils, and the Burkina Russia Coalition. They said Ukraine was not only fighting wars in Europe, they said that it was encouraging terrorism in Africa. They referred to Ukraine as exactly what they think it is now: aim to destabilize Africa and cut off its developing relations with Russia, serving as a stand-in for the West. One of the activists was blunt in his remarks. He claims that African countries are being threatened by Ukraine and its Western allies, who are forcing them to give up their recently acquired independence and sovereignty. They had a clear message: Africa will either suffer or choose the West. However, the Burkina Faso Black Defense League had the most forceful remarks. The coordinator confirmed what many had suspected, that the weapons being provided to Ukraine are actually going straight to terrorists. This is all done with the intention of maintaining unrest in the Sahel, so that the West can maintain control over its enormous mineral wealth. We see what you're doing, and we won't remain silent, he warned NATO as he concluded. However, the countries of the Sahelian State Alliance are unfazed by the pressure, threats, and clandestine operations. Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali. These nations have established a boundary. They have proclaimed war on both terrorism and the international entities that support it. At ES is unfazed by the actions of France, Ukraine, or any other Western power. They fight with vision, sovereignty, solidarity, and the determination to be free in addition to weaponry. What do you think then? Do these accusations against Ukraine represent a perilous reality that the world is unwilling to confront? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. And please do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one.